Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 11th of April 2021. My name is Maggie Lennon. Before I introduce my guests today, I'll run through the latest COVID statistics. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, there were 381 new confirmed cases of COVID, 4 new reported deaths of people who tested positive. 2,643,524 people have received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination in Scotland, and 551,699 have received their second dose. On Saturday and Sunday, only the headline statistics of new cases, deaths and vaccinations have been updated. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,853,471 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 1,632,040 were confirmed negative. That includes me last week. And 221,431 tests were positive. But sadly, since the start of the pandemic, 7,630 patients in Scotland who tested positive with COVID have sadly died. I'm joined today by Kenny Anderson from way up there in rural Aberdeenshire. Kenny is connected to Aberdeen for Independence Movement and Business for Scotland, and Mike Small, owner and founder of Bella Caledonia, the online political and cultural commentary magazine. Welcome to you both. I hope you can hear me and that technology doesn't let us down. I know you said, Kenny, that rural Aberdeenshire is not the best for broadband, but we hope to keep you with us during the programme.
Yeah.
The first story of the day, the biggest story of the week, if you measure big stories by the amount of press coverage, is clearly the death of Prince Philip. The BBC have been coming under immense criticism from its viewers for the amount of the coverage that it imposed upon us, especially on Friday, when both the BBC and ITV removed most of their normal programming in favour of a number of tributes to him. The BBC even set up its own dedicated complaints page where you didn't have to write your complaint, you just had to put your email address in and send it back. So, have the BBC and ITV misunderstood the feeling of the country on this, Mike, or was it a proportionate response to the death of the Queen's husband?
It definitely wasn't proportionate. I think there's a sadness when any human being passes, and Prince Philip was somebody's husband and grandfather. So it's entirely appropriate to mark his passing, and he's an important figure in the British Constitution. But I think that the level of wall-to-wall wraparound coverage was completely inappropriate, and the level of any kind of critical interaction was also dire. So we had instant hagiography where his life is just completely rewritten, and he's represented back to the public as somebody that they just couldn't recognise from the last decades of his public life. He was a hero, a saint, impossibly hardworking, impossibly selfless, heroic environmentalist, and in some cases dressed up as a kind of new man. I mean, it's just extraordinary, baffling coverage. There's another aspect of this, which is that the sort of digital signage that appeared up and down the country felt very Orwellian. And I think that the problem is, particularly for the BBC, that they move from being a public broadcaster to being a state broadcaster, and that becomes quite sinister. I also think that in this time when so many people have suffered through lockdown, the idea of presenting this character who must have been one of the most privileged people in the entire world as a selfless soul is just beyond belief. And I think finally, this is a man who lived till 99, and it's not a tragic death. It's just not. It's a man who lived immense privilege to a very, very old age. So yes, celebrate his life. Yes, Mark is passing. But the sort of coverage that we've had, I think, has been extraordinary, and I think is already creating some kind of a backlash against it.
Yeah, it's interesting this concept, is it not, Kenny, of respect? I mean, I was always taught that respect had to be earned, it's not just given. You don't get it as a matter of course. But all we're hearing is everything is a mark of respect, a mark of respect. Um, do you think, though, this backlash that the BBC and ITV are getting is any sign that we are turning off against the royal family? Or is it more just that the home counties middle classes were being deprived of Monty Don and Gardener's World on Friday night, and that was really what was behind it? Do you think it points to anything deeper?
Um, like everyone else, it's sad for the man's family. It's sad for the country. My default position is probably that I don't believe in inheritance and privilege that exists to create the royal family. But nonetheless, I can understand that the BBC and all the channels and all the radio stations needed to do something, and I would have expected extended news bulletins and maybe a couple of specials. What was remarkable was the shutting down of all channels. I was listening to Radio Scotland at the time, and it just went to a central newscast. And I have a friend who's an avid listener to BBC Radio 6 music, and it went to the central broadcast. So to shut down all the channels just seemed an overreaction and wrong. Meant people had no choice. And I think that's probably why there's been such a wider backlash. It's not just the sort of Republican type elements that have been against it. I mean, the other thing I find is that, in the run up to VE Day celebrations, the anniversary of VE Day, it seemed to take over things. And this has been something similar. And you almost think it's because we want, the powers that be, if it's a state broadcaster, as Mike has suggested, they're trying to distract the population, maybe hide things from us. A friend of mine, Dick Winchester, wrote on Twitter that it's a reflection of our diminished economic, industrial, and social impact on the world, and that the royal family becomes like a comfort blanket. But I think the backlash is because we were denied choice, and there's this almost assumption that we should all be doing a particular thing in relation to our homage of the Duke of Edinburgh, which I think grates with very, very many people. And I certainly took advantage of the BBC's very easy complaints procedure and popped off an email to them about it.
As did we all, no doubt, and shared it widely on Twitter and Facebook to people. I'm quite keen to stick with this idea that it's become the state broadcaster rather than a public broadcaster, because I think there's lots of evidence, as you say, VE Day is an example, but other times when it has crossed that line. We know as well that governments are quite adept at using periods of this when news is reduced or when our attentions are being pointed elsewhere, whether that's forced or otherwise, to bury bad news. We've heard government ministers and government civil servants say that. So not only are we faced with a reduced or very specific news output against which we have no choice, we also have had political campaigning for the elections in Scotland and Wales and local elections in England suspended. Now, do you think, Mike, that there's any justification in a democracy in the 21st century to stop political campaigning when, for example, the future of the royal family is not one of the issues that's under discussion?
No, it feels like a kind of 19th century response, and the last time I checked, we're in the 21st century. I'm not actually very keen on endless BBC bashing because I think it becomes quite reductive. And I think it kind of points all political blame towards the media, which I think is sometimes problematic. I think that there's lots that is really good about the BBC in terms of drama and output and broadcasting. But I think in this situation, it is um, it is really problematic. And I think that the kind of meta-narrative, the sort of message that's being put out, is one about deference, because that's what the royal family is really about. It's about hierarchy and deference. And that is increasingly unsustainable. And I think that we are reaching the point where we will have constitutional crisis mount on constitutional crisis, because the Queen is elderly and she will be replaced presumably by Charles. And I think that that's a deeply unpopular figure. And the role of the state broadcaster in kind of overhyping this institution is not landing in the way they think it is, and it is not landing in different parts of the United Kingdom in the same way. And whilst this is going on, we have water cannon on the streets of Belfast being employed against children who are involved in the rioting and the protest there. And I read this morning in the Observer that Boris Johnson is refusing to host any kind of summit to deal with the unfolding crisis on the streets of Belfast. So I think as these problems kind of mount, the resort to hyper British nationalism, the increasing fervour around the use of flags in schools and in public institutions becomes more and more desperate.
We'll come on to Northern Ireland in just a second. But Kenny, I want to know your views about, do you think there's any justification for stopping political campaigning when these elections are crucially important to the people of Scotland and Wales and the local elections in England? Again, out of this respect or whatever it is, deference, forelock tugging to the royal family. What do you think the party should have agreed to suspend campaigning, or just said, no, sorry, democracy is more important and we carry on?
I think, as it stands, I understand campaigning's going to restart on Tuesday and then stop again on Friday night. And then Sundays are usually quiet anyway from a campaigning point of view, apart from programmes such as this. But I think it's wrong. I think possibly the pause button could have been pressed on Friday, but I think most political campaigners would have been saying something respectful, briefly respectful, and then carrying on speaking about things. So I think suspending is wrong for the length of time we've suspended. And, like Mike, the BBC is what it is. I use the BBC extensively. I look at the website very regularly, at least 5 or 6 times a day. But in recent times, I've actually got RTE's website on my browser as well, because it gives a different perspective, particularly has been in relation to Brexit and so forth. But I've just finished reading Gavin Esler's book on How Britain Ends, and he alludes to the issues of the royal family, the BBC, and how they are being used as a them and us. And it's, he repeatedly refers to the end of the 10 o'clock news when they go, and now the news from where you are, which he equates with not where we are, we being, the home counties, the London media block. So the suspension of campaigning seems to tie in with all of that. And it's almost as if the zealots will be staring at everyone to see how you've responded to the news of the Duke of Edinburgh's death. And if there's any chink or not full homage, then you'll be criticised. And, I was just waiting for the Conservatives to use the opportunity of the negotiations about how long campaigning would be suspended to have a go at anybody who said, let's get going quicker. Patrick Harvey's already come in for horrendous criticism for the Greens' response to the death, which I read again this morning and seems quite reasonable. But
I thought it was extremely reasonable. He was talking about, in general, there was none of this speaking on behalf of the people of Scotland or the people of Wales or any other group of people. And I think that's entirely appropriate for party leaders to talk about their own response, or perhaps that on behalf of their party. But like the both of you, speaking for other people, me, for example, I'm not happy with. And just a final word on respect, it's worthwhile remembering that nearly 150,000 people across the United Kingdom have died from COVID, and they got 2 minutes silence a couple of weeks ago. So I think not proportionate and not fair, given that so many people are grieving for their own loved ones at this time. So we've mentioned Northern Ireland. Let's now turn to that in more detail. We are seeing some of the worst troubles in that part of the United Kingdom since the Troubles. It's 23 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, widely supported, although not supported completely across the north of Ireland, although widely supported in the Republic. It's a complicated reason for the Troubles at the moment. It is linked to Brexit in some respect. It's also linked to the clampdown by the Northern Ireland Police Service of unionist paramilitary organisations, and the unionists are trying very hard to put the blame on Sinn Féin for not being penalised for turning up in vast numbers to a Republican funeral recently. So, Kenny, what's your take on what really lies behind this trouble, and where do you think it's going to lead?
I, I better declare an interest. My mother was born in Ireland, so I'm actually an Irish passport holder as well as a British passport holder.
Lucky you.
And I've been to Ireland. We went every summer on our holidays to Ireland, driving through the north of Ireland and through the hard border that was there in the 1960s. Laughable sometimes when some commentators said there was no hard border, but there was. And I've since been back, and you drive on a motorway from Belfast to Dublin without stopping. And we've all seen the clips of Boris Johnson meeting business people in Belfast, saying that if they had to fill in a single extra form or sign a single extra document after Brexit, then they'd phone him directly. And of course, he had to get some sort of a deal, so he had to agree to a border in the Irish Sea, because unless we stayed in the single market, there was no other way around it. But I think the causes, as everything with Northern Ireland, are very complex. I think the paramilitary organisations are heavily involved in criminal activity in where the initial hotspots have been. So I think they have got reason to flare up trouble for their own criminality as well as terrorist reasons. And of course, it's now spreading to other areas, including Republican areas. I think poverty is at the back of it, a lot of it. I don't think these areas are well catered for in terms of social services, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of progressive policies at all. Where it's heading, I don't think it's heading in a good place at all. There was 30 years of killing and fighting before the Good Friday Agreement, and while it wasn't agreed by everybody, there's been 23 years of relative peace, and Gove and Boris between them have, excuse the pun, blown that out of the water. And it is an excuse, but I'm really not sure where it's going. And I hear voices accusing the EU. I see Ian McWhirter's piece in today's paper talking about borders and allying the arguments for the Irish hard borders with Scotland and England hard borders. And going back again to Gavin Esler in his book, excellent book, How Britain Ends, he talks extensively about the issues in Ireland and the Irish sea border. So I think it's going to get more complicated. I suppose from a selfish and simplistic point of view, it makes me want to have independence much more at the forefront for Scotland. I would personally like to see a united Ireland, but I can see that will cause a lot of problems. But I think a plebiscite is inevitable in Ireland for a united Ireland, and I think the outcome is also as inevitable as Scottish independence is. So, but there may well be problems along that road as well, because the loyalist community will not accept that lightly.
Well, of course, the Good Friday Agreement does allow for, once the first plebiscite is held, for there to be repeating plebiscites every, I think, 9 years on the issue of a united Ireland, which is clearly not something that we ever had factored in to our plans for self-determination. Kenny's right, Mike, when he says that not everyone did support the Good Friday Agreement, but in March of this year, the Loyalist Communities Council, which represents paramilitary organisations such as the Ulster Volunteer Force and the UDA, have removed their support for the Good Friday Agreement very publicly. And at that time, the Chief Constable of the Police Service in Northern Ireland said he didn't think it was going to be a harbinger of unrest. Now, it may well be that he's been proven wrong, and there have been demands for the police constable to resign, not over that issue, over the issue of the Sinn Féin funeral. Do you think that the Police Service of Northern Ireland are complicit in stoking up this issue, or not being acutely aware enough of where it might have led to? And is there any justification for asking for the police constable's resignation?
Well, historically, they're complicit. I don't know enough. I would like to hear more from people on the ground in Northern Ireland. I do think that we are seeing a crisis, and it's a crisis of leadership, both from Britain and from within Northern Ireland. And so it's difficult to see how that's going to be resolved. I do think it's also a generational issue. I read a councillor who explained that 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, suicides have now taken more people than were murdered in the Troubles. And when you look at the strife on the streets, it does seem like yet another generational issue. I think in Britain and in Ireland, we see again and again a kind of generational deficit, whether that's about who voted for Brexit, whether that's about Scottish independence, whether that's about austerity, or whether that's about the climate crisis. Again and again, you see a kind of generational divide, and that's being played out here with children and young people being manipulated and used as proxies for paramilitary groups. So
And
we desperately need something.
that's perhaps one of the biggest tragedies, because these are young people who have been born into a period of peace, and who one hoped were never going to have to live through those divides. But I guess these divides have never gone away. And it's easy to go to Belfast now and see the resurgence of the city, and see how much it's been developed, and to think that actually it's moved on. But you don't have to scratch the surface very deeply in some areas to realise that that's really not the case at all. I really have serious concerns over what's going to happen there. Like Kenny, I would like to see a united Ireland. Whether this makes that more or less likely is impossible to say. But it's worthwhile reminding people that there were senior Conservatives in Scotland who said if there was ever to be an Irish border in the Irish Sea, they would resign. Well, we've got the Irish border in the Irish Sea, and they haven't resigned. So the complicity on this goes much, much wider than the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I'm going to move on to further afield now to the situation, the developing violent situation in the Ukraine. So just to update people and kind of remind people how this has come about, in 2014, Russia annexed the Crimea part of Ukraine because it's traditionally and ethnically Russian, with lots of Russian speakers. At the time, the EU and the United States were extremely concerned about this move by Russia, which they saw as potentially encroaching on the sovereignty of Ukraine, and sanctions were imposed. And really, since then, things have been under the surface, bubbling away, with Russian-backed rebels taking on the who are separatists, who want to break from the Ukraine to have their own mini-state or rejoin Russia, taking on the government and the forces in Ukraine. In the recent weeks, things have escalated and there are huge build-ups of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. The Russians are claiming this is just nothing to do with hoping to cross the border or to impose any pressure on the Ukrainian government. It's simply military maneuvers. But it's concerned the Americans enough for them to have announced this week that they are sending warships to the Black Sea. So, Mike, do we think we might have another area of intense negotiation and diplomatic activity, or is that going to go out the window and we could see ourselves in a violent conflict situation?
Well, I suppose it's an early test for the new Biden regime. I think it's extremely worrying, and I think everything of recent Russian history would point to them being aggressive, militaristic, and a threat. And I think it's a real problem for people within the independence movement as well, because there are a number of high-profile figures who routinely defend Putin and Assad, and seem to be living through the 1970s, where there's some kind of version of the Russia or the USSR that is a left-wing alternative and therefore to be valued. And this kind of strange binary idea you get that what is an extreme authoritarian right-wing regime run by Putin is of some value to the independence movement is an extraordinary position that is indefensible within the Scottish independence movement. So yes, the build-up on Ukraine is extremely worrying. The arrest of a journalist this week is also extremely worrying, and the ongoing civil liberties and human rights assaults in Russia are appalling. It's not a democracy. It's not something to be defended. And that's a challenge for people who are Democrats trying to forge a new democracy in Scotland.
And it's like anything where a focus on nationalism is based around identity or language, that in itself can be quite have a damaging impact on more civic nationalist movements, which is how we've always liked to think the Scottish nationalist movement presents itself, although there's suggestions that may be changing into a slightly darker area. The Russians are warning that the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine are at risk of a Srebrenica-type massacre. That was when, if you remember, 8,000 Muslim men and boys were massacred. Whereas to me, Kenny, it feels a bit more like a Sudetenland situation, where if you remember that part of the Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, the German-speaking part was annexed by Nazi Germany. So is he just being choosy? Is Putin just being choosy with his historical references?
Undoubtedly, it was quite horrendous. The spokesperson that I read about on the BBC website was talking in very aggressive terms about the Russian response to Ukraine. And I think the phrase he used was, we will not be shooting the Ukraine in the leg, we will shoot them in the face, which was quite horrendous. And I saw footage of nuclear strategic mortars being moved to the Ukrainian border, and that's horrendous too. I recently read the Robert Harris book about Chamberlain's peace journey to Berlin before the start of the Second World War, and that was just before and the main subject then was how to sort out the German-speaking people within Czechoslovakia. And very similar situations, very similar guises. I think Hitler was using it as an excuse to escalate everything. And I think Putin is probably using this as an excuse to escalate things. And like Mike, I see no attraction to any situation with Russia, and I'm not really sure what the motives of any Russian government interference would be. I also saw footage this week of the leader of the opposition in Russia, his doctor visiting the prison, and then she herself being arrested, or at least led away under armed guard. The situation in Russia is very, very fragile and very, very scary, and they seem to be increasingly authoritarian. And I'm not really sure what the international community can do. Putting warships into the Black Sea, American warships into the Black Sea, I really, apart from a gesture, I'm not really sure what the next step would be. I'm an avid player of chess, and it was before Queen's Gambit. And I always felt that politicians should have a certain level of ability in chess, because any adherents to the game know that you've got to be able to see about 7 or 8 moves in front to do well. Increasingly, our politicians don't seem to be particularly good at looking 7 to 8 moves ahead. And in these situations where violence could erupt, I think that's an ability that is sorely needed.
Well, we have to be concerned that, it's Ukraine now. It could be any of the other former states of the Soviet Union next. And from the European particular point of view, real concern what might happen over the Baltic states. They're extremely worried that there might be moves on them. There's large Russian-speaking populations in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia who have for some time been saying, we need to get a grip of this. Angela Merkel has been trying her best to rail Putin in, and he's just not interested. So as you say, what can be done? It's interesting to note that as well as warships, there are American bombers on exercise in that part of the world as well. We could see a major conflagration. We could see war. This could escalate very, very badly. And it would appear that there are large, huge parts of the Russian population who absolutely have got Putin's back on this. His popularity is as high as ever. That may be manipulated figures, of course, but I think probably not. Obviously, as you said, that it is a test of the new Biden government. There's another big test for Biden coming. He's just in the process of putting together his first budget. It's quite remarkable in its scope. He is, for the first time, suggesting that there is a tiny increase, only 2% increase in the defence budget, but he's looking for, across the board, something like a 16% increase in things like education, health, and environment spending. He is wanting to put in 1.5 trillion federal plan, which is on top of the several billions and trillion plans that they've put into place over COVID. It's clearly about investing in federal government and finding a federal government answer to some of America's greatest problems. That, Mike, surely is just going to really get up the backs of the Republicans. And although he controls both the Senate and Congress just now, he's got a fight on his hands to get this through, don't you think?
He does, but it's interesting that he is being more progressive and dynamic than a lot of his critics suggested he would be. And one of the reasons for that is that although he's definitely a centrist in the democratic sense, he does have within the Democratic Party a movement of more radical and more left thinkers who have an extremely high profile and presence in the wider society and are influential. And I think that Biden is using the pandemic crisis and the notion of a just recovery or to build back better in exactly the way we should be doing. Not nearly as radical as I would imagine, as I would hope, but the scale of the rebuild and the figures that you're quoting are incredible. And I think in terms of the Republicans, I think that they are in disarray because they are split between having to cleave to the disastrous Trump cult or find a new path, and they are hopelessly divided in that debate.
The overall spending, as I say, is a 16% increase, but in education, it's something like a 43% increase. It's the largest increase proposed in education spending in over 50 years, and it's aimed at tackling poverty in the public schools system, which has been badly underinvested in over the years. What do you think will be the most likely outcome if he gets his education spending through, Kenny? What would we hope to see making the biggest difference to education provision in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of disparities between different parts of America. I mean, there's the city-states which are quite democratic, and places like Massachusetts are quite democratic. But of course, in America, the Republicans will paint any move towards social policies as rampant socialism. I mean, one hopes with education there'll be massive improvements and more outward-looking population than Trump would have directed the population towards. So I think education can only do good if the money is effectively used. But I think there will be a lot of fight back from the Republicans. You look at the situation in Northern Ireland, and you saw some of the scenes in the run-up to the American election, large armed gangs patrolling streets, and you sort of think, well, how far off is, in some areas, some sort of criminal terrorism taking over control of areas. So one hopes education, if the money gets put through and is effective, and the general population can get access to further education as well as primary education, then a difference can be made. But I mean, obviously that takes a long time to feed all the way through, and in the meantime, within 2 years, well, even less than 2 years, there's going to be midterm elections, which could again affect the balance of Congress and the Senate, which may well prevent Biden doing much of what he wants to do.
It's possibly why he's putting in this budget so early. And also people have suggested it's unlikely that Biden will stand for a second term just because of his age and his health. So he's really only got one shot at this. But it's not just Republicans who he's going to struggle with. The Democrats are split on this. So the Conservative side of the Democrats are not convinced about his big government, federal versus state agenda, because the federal versus state agenda really does cut across the founding principles of the United States. And the Democrats on the liberal wing of the party think that even maintaining defence spending to 2% is too much. They want to see huge cuts in defence, which would give even more money to social policy and those kind of agendas. So it's not even clear, I think, Mike, that he'll get the Democrats on side.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the flip side to the more radical voices, is that there are many people within the Democrat Party who really want a Green New Deal and want the military budget re-tracked, re-resourced into climate change action and building the sort of infrastructure that's required for the level of the crisis that we face. So that is true. There's an internal struggle within the democratic and progressive movement in the US, and then externally from reactionary forces and the Republican Party.
And yet, while America still presents itself as the policeman of the world, sending gunboats over to the Black Sea, for example, and bombers, it's difficult to see how he doesn't have to maintain defence spending to what it is. The issue of big government and state intervention is, of course, the bogeyman in terms of Republicans. It's the things they've always feared from Democratic presidents, Democratic Congress and Senates. And Biden's been very clear that that was something he was going to pursue. And perhaps nowhere is it more obvious in his suggestions that federal law has to trump state law, is about the handguns and gun control. He's a big supporter of gun control. He's been quite unambivalent about the unacceptable level of gun death in the United States. And just this week, he's come out particularly about ghost guns. Mike, can you tell us what ghost guns are?
I don't know enough about this subject to speak with authority, but I do know that there are issues also about the technology where you can build your own guns, and that new technology is kind of coming right through the gun debate, where this notion of regulation is taking a completely different form.
Yeah, and he's also wanting to make it harder for people who've got mental health issues to be able to access guns. And so it's not just about the creation and the development of guns, but it's also who's going to have access to them. Kenny, do you think he's got much hope of pushing through an anti-gun agenda?
I don't know. We talked about education, and I haven't seen much polling on the age demographics of what different age groups think and whether things will change. I mean, these kit guns that Mike was talking about, there's also problems with 3D printers now that you can create weapons. And of course, these kit guns, which are legal, don't have serial numbers on them. And in terms of police investigation, tracing weapons through ballistics and so forth to prosecute criminals is key, and serial numbers and regulation is key. I mean, I think Biden has described it as the gun crime, and I think there was another shooting in the last 24 hours, a random shooting in America, and he's described it as an international epidemic, an international embarrassment, which indeed it is. Reading back some of the comments that Duke of Edinburgh made after the Dunblane shooting, it feeds into the narrative in America as well. Referring to the American Constitution and the fact we don't have a constitution, but the problem in America is that everything relates back to a constitution that was written at the end of the 1700s, and it's almost frozen in time, and it's dragged up as being sacrosanct, even to the extent that some right-wingers even try to think about what the founding fathers meant in between the various amendments to the Constitution. So it's very, very hard to fight against that type of thing. And Obama was very keen to progress gun control. Biden is. I suspect he's up against it with the gun support people. There's a very, very heavy lobbying body. There's the rural body. I suspect he's going to struggle badly to achieve that. I think there has to probably be a sea change. Maybe education can feed into that change if young people coming up can recognise the need for change.
There was an interesting initiative in New York a couple of years ago, I think, where a gun store opened in one of the main avenues, and people went in to have a look at the guns. And as they picked guns off the shelf, attached to each one was a history of how that gun had been used in a killing. And that had a tremendously important impact. Now, it did in New York, nice liberal New York, but it brought it home to people that these guns that they could literally go in off the street and buy had been responsible for so many deaths in so many places. Certainly struck me, and I know it had an impact in some parts of the United States. But yeah, as you say, and people misread the Constitution, because my understanding is the right to bear arms is linked to the right to bear arms in order to create militias, not the right to bear arms just as individuals. And just if people were wondering what your comment about Prince Philip was, I believe he said around Dunblane, if someone had gone in with a cricket bat and beaten people to death with cricket bats, you wouldn't ban cricket bats, would you? And that was his suggestion, that banning guns after Dunblane through the Snowdrop campaign was a waste of time. Keeping with the States, and also given that they're talking about putting a lot of money into Social Security and whatever, it's interesting to note that just this week we've been hearing that Google, one of the richest companies in the world, is fighting a battle with hundreds of their lawyers against one of their employees, Chelsea Glasson. She has taken Google to court effectively over what she is saying was intense maternity discrimination against her. She was prevented from taking up promoted positions while she was pregnant. They told her that it would rock the boat, and that because she would be off on maternity leave afterwards, that wouldn't be useful. And when she attempted to return to work after her maternity leave, she was fired with 3 months' salary. Now, this is obviously something that's happening in the United States. Maternity leave for women in the United States is effectively non-existent. There is no national maternity program. There is no national paid leave at all. It's the only country in the developed world where there is none. Although some individual states have brought in laws that allow some paid leave for maternity, it's not the usual. 25% of women in America return to work 2 weeks after childbirth because they simply can't afford to stay off. Now, I don't know, are either or both of you gentlemen fathers?
Yes,
Yeah.
father
Yeah.
of three,
So you both
two
have kids.
daughters.
With daughters, so this is particularly of interest. So what I want to discuss, not specifically this rather grotesque fact that Google are using an army of lawyers against this one woman. It seems a bit unfair because obviously there's no employment tribunal system in the States, so there's no automatic recourse for her to go to, which you would do in this country if you felt you'd been discriminated against. But the fact that the law maybe says you cannot do these things, that you cannot discriminate, doesn't mean that for pregnant women across the globe, discrimination doesn't take place in the workplace. Now, I know, Kenny, you were a businessman. I know that you've had to deal with employment law. How wide would you say maternity discrimination against women is in the workplace? Not your workplace. I'm not suggesting you were ever guilty of it, but generally.
No, I think it's improved dramatically, but I think there still is quiet discrimination, not just at the maternity stage, but at the young children stage as well. I mean, my wife worked in corporate banking, and we had our first child in nursery, and quite often, I mean, this would have been the early 1990s, people would turn around and say, well, we'll have a meeting about that tonight, just at finishing time. So 5:30, 6 o'clock, we'll have a quick 45-minute meeting. And my wife had to turn around and say, well, if I'd known about it this morning, I could easily have attended the meeting, but she was sidelined because she wasn't able to attend because she had arrangements to pick up her son. The two daughters came later. That was the early 1990s. It will have improved since then. And I think because in professional life, there is a much better gender balance further up the management tree. But I've seen in some instances female senior managers being as, if not more, discriminatory than male managers. And that's a worry and a concern. But I think it happens. It's subtle. It's hidden. It's very hard to prove for somebody in dispute. I mean, when you allude to tribunals, I don't know what the backlog in employment tribunals are just now, but I would imagine we'd have to wait an inordinate amount of time. So I think there's a statutory requirement for a claim to be made within a particular length of time. So I think post-COVID, we might have to extend that length of time because of the backlog. But it's there. There is no question at all. I'm not a golfer. Never
you
have
say
been,
that things.
but the golf.
You
So
say that things will have improved since the 1990s. You might be interested to know that a major survey in the last 2 or 3 years in the UK have shown that under 28% of women are in full-time employment or self-employed 3 years after childbirth, as opposed to 90% of men who are in full-time employment or self-employed after they have fathered a child. And 26% of men have either been promoted or moved to a better paid job within 5 years of having a family, as opposed to 13% of women. So actually, it hasn't really improved at all. And their point about women managers being perhaps more discriminatory may have a lot to do with some women feeling, depending on the sector they're in, they have to be almost more male than their male counterparts and tougher as a manager. Pretty sad that, picking on women who are pregnant is a sign of being tough. The Citizens Advice Bureau have a list of, I think, top 10 problems that pregnant women and women with young children face in work. The top one is redundancy. So although it's illegal to make someone redundant because they're pregnant, a lot of women are, and it's very difficult for them to prove that it's as a result of their pregnancy. Obviously, some genuine redundancies will encapsulate pregnant women. Not being hired in the first place because you might be seen to be of childbearing age. And again, it's illegal to ask anyone at an interview what their marital status is or their plans to have children. But we know it happens all the time. Not being promoted because they've had a gap in their career and therefore they're not deemed as experienced as their male counterparts, and not being allowed back into their old job that they had before. So, what, Mike, should be done about this? How do we legislate against this? How do we make sure that this discrimination is stopped? Oh, sorry, Kenny. Mike's got a problem with his
I
sound.
think
Sorry.
I think we've talked about gender balance in boardrooms. Um, I think there's certain professions where it looks on the outside as if women are more acceptable. I think that needs to be spread across wider disciplines. You know, you quite often see confident men of a certain educational background cutting across better educated and better qualified women, and that sort of thing has to be stamped on and frowned upon. Yeah, it's like scourges like drink driving became gradually socially unacceptable. Certain activities and behaviours have got to become socially unacceptable. But it again, we come back to education, talking about respect agendas from a very early age at school. People being taught to respect and consider, but I think it has to come back to education at every level.
And Mike, it isn't just a women's issue, is it? I mean, if
No,
you're stopping the useful economic productivity of 50% of the population, or a percentage of that 50%, that's not good for anyone, is it?
no, and this speaks to issues of workers' rights in a gig economy in contemporary society, beyond the obvious gender issues. I mean, I saw that the Uber drivers have won a landmark case this last week to be recognised as employees and as workers, not just freelancers. And ASDA lost a landmark case as well this week that had a gender aspect to it, where men who were working behind the scenes were getting paid more than women who were working on the in the shop floor. Um, I see also Deliveroo drivers have been on strike, and this is really about the precarious workforce of the gig economy beginning to fight back and have some resistance again against new forms of exploitation. And I think that we're in a completely different land from factory workers and a proletariat and industrial workers, and we're now people being isolated and exploited individually. And so this new resistance is going to be pivotal to fighting back against these latest forms of exploitation.
And it's particularly bad in tech employers. They've got a particularly bad record of workers' rights. So, yes, far too many of their workforce are working in the gig economy, poor working conditions. I mean, old-fashioned poor working conditions, poor ventilation, not enough breaks, that kind of thing, and massive amounts of pay discrimination. And yet these are the companies, the tech companies, who've made all the money during COVID. You're the only people who've really done well out of COVID, and they're the ones who aren't paying tax. So is there something from the tax side point of view that governments could do to bring these companies in line? Mike?
I think that it's highly problematic, and I think the Scottish Government has done very poorly in this, in encouraging companies like Amazon, who pay very little tax, giving them over £100 million incentives to then set up highly exploitative practices. And obviously, during the pandemic, this has been amplified, and we are all, to a greater or less extent, complicit in this. There's talk of what you call neo-feudalism, where we're increasingly domesticated and purchase things through these big tech companies. And that's at the forfeit not just of a tax revenue base, but also of smaller businesses and a local economy that has some real connectivity through society. So
Well,
I think that...
Sorry, no, carry on.
I think that nurturing alternative economics and really thinking about what we mean by developing a local economy and a circular economy as an alternative needs to be taken far more seriously and not just used as kind of slogans whilst we actually roll out the likes of Amazon.
Well, Amazon have been in the news also this week over workers' rights. In Alabama, the Amazon workers had a vote on whether to join the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union. I think they might be the first unionised part of Amazon, certainly in the States. That vote was defeated, but there is a possibility of a legal challenge. There are suggestions that the vote wasn't carried out appropriately. Certainly about 600 votes, not quite enough to overturn the decision, are deemed to be a bit dubious. Now, obviously, there's a lot of chat in America about elections not running properly and votes being dubious, but it's kind of interesting. Thank you both very much for joining me today. We've not really discussed domestic politics at all, apart from the situation in the north of Ireland. It's been a more international programme than perhaps normally. We will have normal service resuming as soon as possible once we're back on the campaign trail in the coming days. So it only leaves me to thank my guests today for their contributions. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Kenny, very much. And I finish, as I always do, with an appeal to help support Broadcasting Scotland. More important than ever, with what we've seen with the public and state broadcasters that we have, that independent broadcasting thrives, but it takes money. We often ask you to think what we could do if we had only 1% of BBC Scotland's budget. We're way short of that. So if you've enjoyed the programme, if you think that independent journalism has a place in Scotland and a voice that's needed, then please consider supporting us financially. Go online to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see how you can help, donate and support us going forward. We've a big job to do over the next 4 or 5 weeks leading up to the election, and an even bigger job to do in giving that independent voice a hearing as we move towards possibly the next referendum. So thank you again to my guests. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. I'll be back on Monday night with Scotland at 7. I hope to see you then. Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.